Imagine being a teenage girl thousands upon thousands of years ago, looking down and suddenly seeing blood for the first time. No one had prepared you for it. There was no doctor to call, no instruction manual, and probably no explanation waiting for you. Yet this experience would eventually happen to nearly every woman who ever lived, making menstruation one of the most universal events in human history. And somehow, it is also one of the least discussed. History books are packed with wars, kings, inventions, and disasters, while this ordinary biological experience is often barely mentioned. So let's take a closer look at what we actually know. Before we can understand how prehistoric women dealt with menstruation, we need to understand why menstruation begins in the first place. Puberty is not simply your body reaching a certain birthday. From an evolutionary perspective, the body is constantly asking a practical question. Is there enough energy available to support reproduction? In the 1970s, researcher Rose Frisch proposed that a certain level of body fat was associated with the beginning of menstruation. Her early estimate was around 17%, although later research has refined and debated the exact figures. The larger idea, however, remains important. Reproductive development depends not only on age, but also on whether the body has enough stored energy to make pregnancy biologically realistic. In other words, your body has something like an internal fuel gauge. If resources are scarce, reproduction can be delayed. Nature is surprisingly practical that way. Before the body starts preparing for motherhood, it wants to know whether there is enough fuel in the tank. That leads to a fascinating question. If energy availability affects puberty, when would a prehistoric girl have experienced her first period? Probably later than most people today would expect. In modern populations with reliable access to food, the average age of first menstruation is generally around 12 or 13. But research among traditional hunter-gatherer communities has shown a different pattern. Anthropologist Nancy Howell studied the Kalahari Kung, a population living under a traditional lifestyle, and observed that girls often experienced menarche considerably later, around 16. High levels of physical activity, relatively lean diets, and the enormous amount of energy required simply to survive could all contribute to delaying reproductive development. That gives researchers a reasonable basis for thinking prehistoric girls may also have reached menstruation later than modern teenagers in well-nourished societies. Not because something was wrong with them, but because their bodies were responding to the environment around them. And that brings us back to our prehistoric teenager. Imagine her at roughly 16, living thousands of years ago, suddenly experiencing her first period. Here is where we have to be careful. We have absolutely no way of knowing exactly what she felt or thought. Nobody left behind a diary explaining her reaction. There is no ancient note saying, "Today was extremely confusing." Anyone claiming to know precisely how a particular prehistoric girl responded is filling in a blank that archaeology cannot fill. What we can do is examine traditional societies from more recent history. Anthropologists have documented how different cultures responded when girls experienced menarche, and the patterns are surprisingly varied. In many societies, a first period was not treated as something that had to remain completely hidden. It could be accompanied by a period of seclusion, a ceremony, or even a celebration. The details differed enormously from culture to culture. But the important point is that menstruation was often openly recognized as a major transition in a girl's life. We cannot automatically assume prehistoric communities behaved in exactly the same way. That would go beyond the evidence. But these examples do challenge the idea that menstrual secrecy is an eternal feature of human society. It may be far more cultural and historical than universal. And honestly, there is something reassuring about that. Humans have never had just one way of understanding the body. Different societies have created very different meanings around the same biological reality. What feels embarrassing in one culture can be completely ordinary in another. If you think about it, menstruation is one of those experiences that connects people across enormous stretches of time, even when everything else about their lives was completely different. Comment 0. If you think we should talk more openly about the everyday experiences that history usually leaves out. But now we run into one of archaeology's biggest problems: figuring out what prehistoric women actually used to manage menstrual bleeding is extremely difficult. The reason is almost painfully simple. Whatever materials they used were probably things such as plants, fibers, moss, or animal hide. Those materials are organic, and organic materials usually decay. They do not conveniently survive for thousands of years underground, waiting for an archaeologist to discover them. So when someone confidently says they know exactly what prehistoric women used during their periods, there is a major problem with that claim. We do not have some perfectly preserved prehistoric menstrual product sitting in a museum with a label explaining its purpose. Instead, researchers have to work with reasonable possibilities. Prehistoric communities already had access to soft plant fibers, moss, animal hides, and other absorbent materials. Similar materials were useful for everyday tasks and sometimes for dealing with wounds. Because of that, it is reasonable to suggest that some of these materials may also have been used to manage menstrual blood. But reasonable is not the same thing as proven. The distinction matters, especially when the physical evidence has disappeared. History gets much easier to reconstruct once people begin writing things down. Suddenly, instead of relying almost entirely on archaeological clues, we have actual records describing health, bodies, and medical practices. One of the oldest surviving medical documents focused specifically on women's health is the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus from ancient Egypt, dating to roughly 1800 BCE. It discusses a range of reproductive and gynecological concerns, including menstrual problems, pregnancy, and contraception. A few centuries later, another important Egyptian medical text appeared, the Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE. It includes references to different patterns of bleeding, including distinctions between regular and irregular bleeding. That tells us something important. Thousands of years ago, Egyptian medicine was already treating menstruation as a legitimate medical subject, important enough to record alongside other reproductive health concerns. Sometimes the most ordinary parts of human life are the ones that reveal the most about a civilization. People may not have understood menstruation in the same biological terms we use today, but they clearly recognized that it mattered. The Greeks and Romans later expanded the written medical discussion even further. Soranus of Ephesus, a physician active around the 1st or 2nd century CE, produced an extensive 4-volume medical work known simply as Gynecology. His writing covered menstruation, reproductive anatomy, contraception, pregnancy, and childbirth. He even advised women to rest when dealing with especially difficult menstrual symptoms. In that respect, some of his advice might sound surprisingly recognizable to a modern reader. It is remarkable to realize that detailed medical discussions about menstruation existed thousands of years ago. The ancient world was clearly paying attention to the subject, even if its explanations were often very different from what modern medicine understands today. There is a strange contrast, though. While written records about menstruation survive from antiquity, actual physical menstrual products from those same periods are almost impossible to find in the archaeological record. Again, the explanation is frustratingly ordinary. Cloth, plant fibers, and other soft organic materials simply do not preserve well over thousands of years. They disappear long before archaeologists ever have a chance to examine them. Ancient writers occasionally referred to absorbent materials, but modern historians have to be cautious when interpreting those references. A passing description in an old text does not automatically prove exactly how a material was used, and the direct physical evidence is extremely limited. This is also why some popular claims about ancient menstrual products deserve a second look. A fascinating fact can travel around the internet for years, but when researchers follow it back to the original evidence, the foundation can sometimes be much weaker than the story suggests. That is one of the strange challenges of studying ordinary life in the ancient world. The things people used every single day were often the least likely things to survive. Kings leave monuments, armies leave weapons, ordinary people leave behind almost nothing. And then we arrive at one of the most surprising parts of the story. The convenient menstrual products that seem completely normal today are actually very new. The first commercially marketed sanitary pad is generally associated with a product called Lister's towels, introduced around 1896. But it was far from an instant success. Victorian social attitudes made menstruation such an uncomfortable subject that openly advertising or discussing menstrual products was extremely difficult. Imagine that. Humanity had been dealing with menstruation for hundreds of thousands of years, yet selling something specifically designed to manage it could still be considered too embarrassing to discuss publicly. Sometimes technology does not move forward simply because people invent something useful. Society also has to become comfortable enough to admit that the problem exists. A major shift came during World War I. Nurses noticed that a material originally designed for treating battlefield wounds could absorb blood remarkably well. The material was disposable cellu cotton, and its use for menstrual care helped inspire the development of commercially produced sanitary pads. A product created for one medical purpose ended up influencing another. It is one of those accidental developments that seems obvious only after someone discovers it, and the modern tampon took even longer to arrive. Dr. Earl Haas patented a tampon design with an applicator in 1931. The product eventually reached consumers under the name Tampax during the middle of the 1930s. So consider the timeline for a moment. Human beings had been menstruating for our entire species' history, but the disposable products that now seem completely ordinary are only about a century old. For almost all of human existence, women had to manage menstruation using whatever materials were available around them. There were no supermarket aisles filled with choices, no standardized products, no detailed instructions printed on packaging, and certainly no smartphone quietly reminding you that your period might be arriving tomorrow. Instead, knowledge was passed between generations. People observed what worked, adapted to their environment, and relied on whatever resources their community could access. That makes menstruation a remarkably quiet part of human survival. It happened again and again, across countless generations, in places that had completely different climates, cultures, technologies, and ways of life. And perhaps that is what makes the history of menstruation so fascinating. It is not really a story about one invention or one civilization. It is a story about ordinary people repeatedly solving an ordinary problem with whatever they had. Comment 1 if you had never realized how recently modern menstrual products actually appeared. For most of history, there was no convenient solution waiting on a store shelf. There was simply a person, a body doing what bodies do, and the practical knowledge needed to deal with it. The historical record may be almost silent about many of those experiences, but that silence does not mean they were unimportant. Quite the opposite. Sometimes the things that leave the fewest artifacts were the things people were dealing with every single day. And when you step back far enough, menstruation becomes more than a biological process. It becomes one of those small, persistent threads running through the entire human story, connecting people who lived tens of thousands of years apart without ever knowing one another. The teenager who once looked down and saw blood for the first time would have faced a world completely different from ours. Yet the basic experience itself would have been familiar to millions upon millions of women who came before and after her. That continuity is easy to overlook because modern life has made the process so much more private, convenient, and commercial. But beneath all the packaging, technology, and social expectations is something incredibly old. Human beings have been figuring this out for as long as human beings have existed. And in that sense, one of the most overlooked parts of our history is also one of the most enduring.